If you or someone you know has a story, encounter, or experience you would like to share with my viewers, please send it to my email at stories@whatlurksbeneath.com. Thank you. It was about July 5th, 2015. It was late, about 3:30 a.m. I had fallen asleep on my cousin's sofa, about 10 p.m. after a long day at our family reunion. All of a sudden, the dog started going crazy. It woke me up, so I kinda laid there, thinking to myself I wish they would shut up. Then, all of a sudden, I heard one of the dogs yell out like it was hurt. Then, I heard the sound of something coming up on the front porch, so I sat up to look out the front window. It just so happens that we left the porch light on, and what I saw was unforgettable and unbelievable. It was squatting down right in front of me. I guess it was too big to stand straight up on the porch. I don't know why it was there, but we had left the empty beer and soda cans and leftover food scraps and a couple of trash bags to be thrown out the next day. But, to make a long story short, I was no more than 8 to 10 feet away from it. I looked at it for what seemed like an hour, but I never actually saw its face because its back was to me the whole time, and I never leave my .45 caliber. But, for some reason, I did not have it with me this time. If I had, you would have had a corpse to show the world, but this thing has become aggressive in this area of Alabama where my family lives. July 8th, it kills my cousin's bulldog. In May, it chases another family member. In June, it looks into a family member's window in broad, open daytime. So I'm trying to get some of the guys together and try and kill it, because no one will do anything to research and capture this thing. We know where it lives and how it travels. All we want is for somebody to capture it and remove it. I live in Texas, but my family resides in Alabama, and they are living in fear of this thing, so it has to go one way or another. When my aunt was about 11 or 12 years old, she was helping her older cousin Jerry in the field at her aunt's house in an area they called Screamer in Henry County, Alabama. It was a hot day, and after some time, Jerry grew very thirsty and asked my aunt to walk up the road to the house and get him a glass of water. My aunt then walked through the field back toward the dirt road leading to her aunt's house. Upon reaching the dirt road, she saw two creatures standing on the other side of the road. She stopped and began slowly backing up, and then stopped again. She stood there looking at them, and they looking at her, for about a minute or so, long enough for her to get a good look at them. They were only around 10 feet away from her at that point. She on one side of the dirt road, and they on the other. She described them as standing next to each other. One was, in her estimation, around 5 feet tall, and the other was slightly shorter, around 4 feet tall. She said that she got the impression they were young. She said that they were really hairy and completely covered in dark brownish black hair, that they looked sort of like gorillas but with human-looking faces with hair on them, human-looking hands and human-looking feet. She said their noses were free of hair and that the color of their noses was dark brown or black, as were their feet and hands. They stood very still, other than blinking, just looking at her. Except for being covered in thick hair, their faces looked human with regular human-looking noses. After a minute or so, she took off running as fast as she could back up to the house to get water Jerry had requested. She did not look back as she ran. She got the water and proceeded to walk back toward the field. The creatures were not there anymore. She never told anybody about this incident until just a couple of months ago, because she was always afraid people would make fun of her. This would have been in summer of 1953, with the nearest road being Highway 95. It was a few days after Hurricane Frederick. I was 11 years old at the time. We lived in a trailer on Hurricane Road, and my grandparents owned the Hurricane Landing and Fish Camp, what is now Perkins Landing. We were left without power after the hurricane, so all of our food was on ice. It was about 11 p.m., and my dad asked me to walk to my grandparents' store and get some ice. so I grabbed a flashlight and took off walking. It was less than a quarter of a mile from our house to the store, and I was already very used to walking the route on a daily basis. So I'm walking down the left side of the road, and I could hear the dogs barking and really cutting up. They belonged to an older man who lived in a little white house down the road on the right. He kept them in a pen behind his house, so when I get in the front of the house, I shine my light across the street, at and around the house. Suddenly, I see something very large run from behind the house on two legs. I followed it with my light as it ran towards the woods, and then it stopped and turned and looked at me. Its eyes glowed red in the dark, and all of a sudden, it runs straight at me. It was so fast. I mean, it traveled probably about 30 or 40 yards in just a flash, and then it stopped right at the edge of the road. I was scared frozen. I couldn't scream or run, and we just stood there for what seemed like an eternity, but in all actuality was probably just a second or two. Then suddenly, it let out a high-pitched growling sound, and then I screamed, and it turned and ran, and I ran all the way home. When I got home, I was so upset that I could hardly breathe or talk. My parents finally calmed me down, and I told them what happened, but they didn't believe me. The next day, my dad and my uncle went down there to look for tracks, but they didn't find any. My uncle told me I probably saw a bear, but even I know a bear can't run on two legs. The creature I saw was extremely large. I would have to say now that it was at least 7 feet tall, very broad shoulders, covered from head to toe in dark brown to black hair. His mouth and large, square teeth kind of stuck out from the rest of the face, and the eyes were sunk in. As a veteran, I can tell you that I've never been so scared in my life. I have been reluctant to share my story because of my field of work, and do not want to have people think I'm crazy, as this could severely damage my career. But as I get older, I feel this incident needs to be documented. The incident occurred in the winter of 1980, just a few miles east of Clayton, Alabama, in Barber County. I was traveling with my aunt, grandmother, and 4 younger cousins to a relative's house. It was dark and probably around 9 p.m., from the best that I can remember. For some reason, though, my aunt needed to turn around and proceeded to pull off the roadway by a small clearing. I was in the front seat of the car with my aunt, who was driving, and my grandmother. As we turned off the road, the headlights caught a figure in mid-stride. It then immediately froze and did not move anymore. It was about 30 yards away from the car, very close. I could see the entire side view of this creature, and its body was slightly turned so that it was looking at us. The most terrifying thing in my memory is this thing's huge eyes glaring at us. The best way I can describe the creature's expression is stunned. The face was covered in hair except for around the eyes. The hair was dark and appeared longer and wavy looking on the arms and legs. It was very tall and massive, but yet also lean looking. I would say it was easily over 7 feet tall, if not more. When it froze in the headlights, one arm was slightly extended behind the creature, and it held this position. At this point, my grandmother was crying and begging for my aunt to drive away. 2 of my younger cousins were huddled on the floorboard in the back seat crying. I was terrified but could not look away. My aunt kept telling my grandmother, "There is no way he can get in this car." And she kept the car still, and we watched this motionless creature for about 2 to 3 minutes. It was almost completely motionless. It was as if the creature thought we could not see him if he did not move. I don't know how it stood so still. The hair on my neck is standing on end as I type this. It scared me terribly. He kept staring at us with those eyes stretched very wide open. I'll never forget that look he gave us. Finally, my aunt decided to flash the lights on and off real quick. The instant that she did this, the creature jumped toward the woods and was gone. He was about 10 yards from the woods, but made it there in less than a second. I can't believe how fast this huge creature could move. The event itself traumatized me. I have never been able to go into the woods alone or enjoy camping since this event. I tried to deer hunt but could not enjoy it and quit. I cannot sit alone in a tree stand without thinking of this creature and becoming tense. I can't imagine coming upon this thing alone in the wilderness. I know these creatures exist. There is no doubt in my mind. I saw one up close and personal. We never saw the creature again. My grandmother says that she and my late grandfather saw a strange creature near their home in the early 1950s. This home is located about 4 miles from my original 1980 sighting. She and my grandfather went out on the front porch late one night and saw a creature standing in the edge of the woods near the house. They could only see its chest and arms in the shadows. She said it was tall and hairy. My grandfather yelled at the creature, and it ran back into the woods, towards a stream, and made a great deal of noise thrashing throughout the trees and brush. She said they did find some strange 3-toed footprints the next day, but they never had another encounter with the creature after my incident. I was driving a VW bus, so I had a good view of my surroundings. As I rounded the first corner of the exit, I noticed what I thought was a big white dog, like an Afghan running on all fours towards the road, up on an embankment. We both reached the same point at the same time, and I thought I would hit the dog. It seemed it didn't notice my car until it reached the side of the road, when it was only feet away. I don't remember slowing much, but I wasn't going very fast to start with, as the curve was pretty tight. As the creature reached the road and I saw it, it stood up on its back legs. It was covered with long white hair, maybe 8 inches long. It wasn't thick but more stringy and dirty looking, and it had a round head, not a dog. I passed the creature and didn't catch it in my mirrors as it was dark. It scared me. I didn't get much detail of its face, but I did notice a fairly large mouth, or lips, which were very prominent. The head was not huge and the body was fairly slender. It was probably as tall as the VW when it stood up, well over 6 feet. On November 9th, 2008, a suspicious knocking was heard about 3 a.m. as my husband was camping with Boy Scouts on the side of a ridge southeast of Henderson Peak, about 200 yards from State Road 281. This is just south of the Chiaja State Park line. It was about 14 degrees with intermittent howling wind. There were 3 sets of 2 knocks each, about 100 yards north of the campsite, described as a piece of firewood hitting another. It was very loud, and the knocks, though themselves rhythmic, were spaced so that the wind died down before they occurred again. These were not little limbs hitting each other, and he was not able to determine if there was any response because of the wind. There were no campers north of them, and the only other campers on the mountain that were encountered was another Boy Scout troop, camping about 4 miles away, directly on Lake Chinobi. My husband is an avid Bigfooter, who awoke and immediately felt that this was consistent with other knocking activity. Due to the inclement conditions and not wanting to scare the younger kids in the camp, he did not have the chance to follow up. Although he didn't mention the sounds the next morning, another adult did, and with careful roundabout questioning, all other factors for the sounds were excluded, like trees falling, wind, limbs hitting each other due to the wind, etc. I am typing this since he was not sure of the cause of the sound, and was reluctant to report something that may not have been genuine. There are other reports of activity in the Talladega areas, and we know of one other not reported in Perry County. This particular sighting happened in July of 2007, and was about a 1-hour drive, shorter as the crow flies, from this incident. My husband also observed suspicious activity as a youth, 12 to 14, while hiking with his uncle somewhere in the vicinity of the Vincent County, in the form of a huge noise about 40 yards from them as they stood in a creek, and upon climbing out observed twisted branches about 2 inches thick and uprooted bushes, which was taken as the huge sound they heard. He was not interested nor had knowledge of Bigfoot at the time. It affected them so much, though, immediately, and they left the area. About 7 years ago, my wife and I were at a lake in the middle of the Talladega National Forest in Alabama. The lake was Sweetwater Lake. We were fishing in a small boat at the end of a slough early in the morning. We were the only ones at the lake. I think it was on a Wednesday, and we were all alone. We heard something scream. It started out as a howl and turned into a long, high-pitched scream, and it was so loud that it echoed through the mountains. It made the hair stand up on the back of our necks. But that is not all. About a year before that, my stepfather and I were hiking around the same lake. We like to fish a spillway on the back side of the lake. About half a mile into the hike, we crossed a fire break about 20 feet wide. Now keep in mind that we are pretty good, way back in the woods. We have crossed rocks, thorns, and briars and all kind of rough ground. And right there across the dried mud in the fire break is a set of footprints dried into the mud. They were not huge, they were about the size of a full-grown man, but they didn't look human. I just couldn't understand why a man would be this far back in the woods without shoes on. And over the years, there's one thing I have thought about a Bigfoot would have to grow up, so maybe it was a juvenile. At the end of January 2013, I was traveling north on Alabama Highway 51 in northern Coffee County, in a rural area approximately 1 mile south of the Dale County line, just before dark. I estimate the time to be around 5 p.m. As I approached a left curve, I noticed a large dark mass in the roadway. At this point, I was within 100 yards of it. Suddenly, it moved to my right, and in about 3 steps, it was on the shoulder of the road, facing me. It was a bipedal creature, approximately 9 feet tall with a shoulder span approaching 4 feet, with the most intense yellow-green eyes that I've ever seen, spaced around 6 to 8 inches apart. In my headlights, I could see it was covered in gray-brown hair. The face was ape-like with dark brown, black, leathery skin. This creature lifted its left arm, possibly to shield its eyes or perhaps anticipating being hit, as I was about 30 feet from it. Then, I was past it. It took several seconds for the significance of what had occurred to sink in. In 1979 and 1980, I was living in my grandparents' old home place on our family farm in Alabama. The farm was about 300 acres of woods, covering an area of deep hollows leading down to sloughs off a river. In late summer and fall of '79, we had been having trouble with deer poachers and some cattle rustling on our farm. So I was spending a lot of time out at night and on my off days trying to catch them. Several times at night and a couple of times during the day, I had heard strange screams back in the woods towards the river. The first time I heard them, I thought it might be a peacock or a screech owl, but it really didn't sound like either, and it seemed to be much louder and much more prolonged. I really didn't think much of it until one night I was walking back to the house from the back of the farm at about 11 p.m. It was a clear night with a bright half moon shining, and I could see quite well. I was skirting along the south edge of the woods, about a half mile due north of the house, when suddenly I got a creepy feeling that I was being watched and or was in danger. My skin started crawling, and the hair on the back of my neck and hands stood up. At the same time, my dog, a large Doberman Pinscher, started acting nervous and whining quietly, and started looking back over his shoulder to our left towards the woodline. I eased the safety off my rifle and increased my pace. Right at that instant, something screamed right in the edge of the woods, less than 35 yards behind and to the left of us. The pitch and volume of the scream was incredible. I could feel my chest vibrating from the loudness of the scream. My dog and I both broke, and I ran to our right into the pasture, about 50 yards, and I spun around and stopped with my rifle up to see if it was chasing us, but it wasn't. I stood there with my rifle up, and whatever it was screamed at us 5 or 6 more times. Also, I could hear movement in the dry leaves where the sound was coming from. It sounded like a large person pacing back and forth. I could also see the tops of some saplings and the small trees sway and move as it bumped into them or pushed and pulled on them. The screams were longer lasting and a little lower pitched than what I had heard before. I also know for sure that they weren't bobcat screams. I became aware of the sound of our cattle running away towards the southwest. The woods got quiet, but I knew it was standing there, still watching me. But I never saw anything. I backed away for about 100 yards and then broke into a jog back to the house, spinning around and stopping with my rifle up and about every 50 yards or so, just to make sure it wasn't following me. A few nights go by. I was up late, 1:30 a.m., and getting ready for bed. I came out of the bathroom into my bedroom, and my dog was standing there, staring towards the front of the house. He was completely stiff, with the hair standing up on the back and the neck, and he was growling very low and menacingly. It was the only time I have ever seen him do that, and he was deadly serious. I got a glimpse of a shadow move across the corner of my front bedroom window, moving towards the west side of the house. The moon was shining right on the west wall of the house. My dog turned towards the west and kept growling even more seriously. Then I saw a large, sort of human-shaped shadow move across both windows on the west side of the house. The dog kept turning and growling and following the shadow. Whatever it was, had to have been about 10 feet tall to cast a shadow that far up on the windows. I was petrified with fear. I finally picked up my riot shotgun and chambered a round of buckshot. My dog at this time was staring towards the north window of the spare bedroom and was still stiff, but not growling quite as bad. I got up enough nerve to look out the bathroom window, but saw nothing. My yard was surrounded by a 3-foot-high hog wire fence with 2 strands of barbed wire on top and locked steel gates. So whatever it was stepped over the fence to get into and out of my yard. The gates made a lot of noise if you tried to climb or open them, so it did not come or go through the gates. In the following weeks, while I was walking through the woods near the river, in 2 different locations, I found several deer that had been killed. At the time, I thought poachers had done it, but they were all complete except for having their abdomens torn open and the guts pulled out. None of the meat was gone from any of them, other than what possums or coons had eaten, and most of them had broken legs. Only one was a buck, and it was a yearling spike. One of the deer had been killed right where I found it. There were broken limbs and saplings and hair all around it. There were tufts of deer hair hung in the bark of 2 larger trees next to the carcass. Some of the tufts were over 10 feet off the ground. Both of the deer's back legs were broken and twisted. Even then, I thought that it looked like something had grabbed that deer by the back legs and beaten it to death against the tree. I didn't tell anybody about any of this. My dad and other folks had told me that people had been hearing and seeing strange things along that part of the river for decades. But I had a neighbor that had told about seeing a Bigfoot on his property just a few years earlier, and everybody laughed at him. In the early fall of 1980, my wife was bringing in the wash one night, about 7 p.m. I had fed the horses some oats about 30 minutes earlier, and I was now in the kitchen, and suddenly I heard a scream outside. I ran out and my wife was running in, scared nearly to death. Something was right outside the gate between the storage shed and the tack room, screaming just like before. The horses went running out there, wide open. The fence and gate there is quite high because there is a corral there also. I could hear it moving around, but only get a glimpse of it occasionally. It was much taller than the 6-foot fence there, and it appeared to be black with maybe a little silver or gray mixed in. There's a street light in our yard on that side of the house, and when it moved under through a patch of light, I could see the light glint off its fur. It was tall enough that it hit or shoved aside some tree limbs that I had to jump to be able to touch. It screamed several more times, and I could tell that it was becoming more and more agitated. Between screams, I could hear it making a very eerie, strange noise with an intermittent clicking sound that sounded like it was growling as it chewed or moved its mouth. I ran back to the house and locked all my doors. We moved shortly after that, and I spent hardly any time on the farm until we moved back to the area in 1997. My son, daughter, and I, and a couple of 2 friends were coon hunting on the back of the farm near the river last year, which would have been November 1999. And the dogs were down on the east side of the ridge, and we were waiting up on the top of the ridge for them to tree. We started to hear the same screams as before, 600 yards to the west of us, in one of the areas where I had found a dead deer before. The screams lasted maybe 30 seconds to a minute, and then came to a stop. We had tried to get the dogs to go in that direction earlier, and they wouldn't, and we tried again, but they kept circling back around and going to the truck. And these are championship dogs. I didn't get to go back in the woods there until April of this year, which is 2000. I found fresh deer bones in the area where I had found several dead deer 20 years before. Well, me and my cousin were deep in the woods, deer hunting, close to our little campsite, when we heard some very loud popping sounds, maybe 35 yards away. We froze, tried to figure out the sound, but couldn't. We started walking. It was getting late, almost dark, when we started to smell something. It smelled awful, deader than dead. My cousin hears something walking heavy. We turn around to look down the logging road and sees this thing step out of the tree line. It was a good 40 to 45 yards away and had dark brown hair, walked on two legs, and was nearly 9 to 10 feet tall. The thing just stood there. Out of being so scared, we couldn't move either. I couldn't have shot it if I wanted to, but we stared at each other for about 3 or 4 minutes. When it took a step into the woods, we ran. First time ever seeing anything like that. I told some people, but they laughed and asked me how much I had been drinking. But I don't drink, so I saw the sight and decided to get this off my chest. I've been holding on to this for years, and I haven't been deer hunting that far into the woods since then. This was around Highway 72, off of Baker Lane. I was deer hunting in Freedom Hills Management Area, around Coon Dog Cemetery. I entered the woods before daylight and walked down the access road next to a pine forest. I came to the back of some pines where they had turned into heavy hardwoods. I sat down at the bottom of a tree and waited for daylight. During my way up, behind me on top of the ridge, I hear a series of grunting and heavy movement through the woods, walking down the ridge behind, and down the ridge it went. Once daylight came, I walked up to where I first heard the grunting and movement. As I got to the area, I found bedding and hair. The hair I found I kept as a sample, and it wasn't wild hog or bear, nor mountain lion. This whole incident scared me and made me very uneasy. Later that night, we heard wood knocks and had a tree pushed down. At approximately 1:30 in the morning, on a night in February 2000, the witness and a friend were planning to visit a girl who lived close to the sighting location. They were riding together on a motorcycle and knew they would not be able to ride up to the girl's house without altering her mother of their presence. They decided to hide the bike on the side of a dirt road and walk to the house from there. Very shortly thereafter, they began to hear what the witness described as a very heavy walking, stomping noise. The witness described these sounds as similar to 1, an extremely large person walking, or 2, like a horse galloping, but only on 2 legs, coming from a swampy area which was only northeast of their location. They squatted in the bushes and listened for a couple of moments, at which time they determined the noise was getting closer to them and increasing in pace. At this time, they decided to make a break for the motorcycle and vacate the area. The friend of the witness was in the lead and caused a branch to swing back, hitting the witness in the head, knocking him down and damn near knocking him out. He got back up and began running after his friend, all the while hearing the sounds of stomping and crashing of underbrush, getting closer and closer to them. When he reached the spot where the motorcycle had been stashed, his friend was already pushing it out towards the road. He commented that, at this time, he could also hear heavy breathing which seemed to coincide with each footfall. Once they had the bike on the road, they both jumped on and his friend managed to kick-start it and take off. The witness stated that he looked back just in time to see a very large creature leap from the edge of the woods out onto the road. I later measured this distance and it was around 12 feet to 15 foot. He said it hit the road on all fours and then stood fully erect. He did comment that when the creature landed on the road, it let out an audible grunt he could hear even above the noise of the motorcycle. He said the moon was full, or near full, and it was already in the western sky, causing the creature to stand in its own shadow. Since the creature was silhouetted, he was unable to make out any such details like facial features. However, he did emphasize to me that what he saw was not a bear, as he's seen bears before and they were much more narrow than what he saw. He also emphasized this by hunching his arms forward and dropping his shoulders to indicate how a bear would stand, and then standing fully erect with his arms out from his sides in the stance that he said he observed the creature to be in. He said this creature was very wide and had fluffy-like hair, which covered it entirely. He was unable to see any fingers on the hands, although he did state from what he could tell, the hands appeared to be clenched, and that the arms were no longer than a human's. He also said that from what he could see, the creature appeared to be a dark brown or black color. When asked about the height of the animal, he said it was at least 6 to 7 feet tall. After thinking for a moment, he stated that his father is 6'4", and that this thing was bigger than his dad, making it closer to 7 feet in height total.